On January 30th, 2026, the Department of Justice uploaded 3 million pages of Jeffrey Epstein's files to the public record. Most people scrolled past it. Dataset. 9 contains an email from June 18th, 2011. The subject line reads, "Russia says IMF chief jailed for discovering all U.S. gold is gone." You were told the dollar is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. You were told Fort Knox holds 147.3 million ounces of gold. That's the common belief. Here's the contrarian reality. The gold hasn't had a physical public audit since 1953, 73 years of silence. Which means, if the bars sitting in those vaults are tungsten wrapped in gold foil, your $38 trillion national debt becomes mathematically unpayable by Tuesday. Today, I'm walking you through the 3-stage forensic breakdown. Stage 1, the Germany Repatriation crisis. Stage 2, the accounting law that lets the Treasury fake the price of gold. Stage 3, why 2026 is the deadline where the script either resets or collapses. A mandatory protocol before we open the file. This is not financial advice. I'm not a licensed advisor. The math follows the script, but your capital is your responsibility. Always conduct your own research. Let's start with the second largest economy in Europe asking a simple question. Where is our gold? In 2013, Germany's Bundesbank made a formal request to the New York Federal Reserve. They wanted 300 tons of their gold back. Not all of it. Just 300 tons out of the 1,500 tons Germany had stored in Manhattan since the Cold War. On the Fed's response, 7 years. You see, when a central bank asks for its own property and the custodian says it will take 7 years to return it, that's not logistics. That's a confession. Germany wasn't asking for a moon landing. They were asking for metal bars sitting in a labeled vault. The Fed had decades to prepare for this. But instead of handing over the bars with Germany's original serial numbers, they said they'd need until 2020 to complete the transfer, which means one of two things. Either the bars were never there, or the bars were there, but they weren't Germany's anymore. When the gold finally arrived in Frankfurt between 2013 and 2017, the Bundesbank did something unusual. They melted down every single bar and recast it. Why? Because the original German bars had been replaced. The serial numbers didn't match. The weights were slightly off. The purity wasn't guaranteed, so Germany took the diplomatic route. They didn't accuse the Fed of fraud. They just quietly erased the evidence by melting it into new bars. Plus, this isn't the first time this pattern appeared. In 1974, the U.S. allowed a small delegation of congressional staff and journalists to tour Fort Knox for the first time in decades. They were shown a single vault. They were not allowed to bring independent assayers. They were not allowed to drill core samples. The tour lasted less than 2 hours. No audit since. You were told Fort Knox holds 8,000 tons of gold valued at $11 billion on the Treasury's books. But here's the fine print. The statutory price used for that accounting is $42.22 per ounce. The market price today is over $5,000 per ounce, which means the Treasury is either sitting on $800 billion in real value, or they're sitting on tungsten and waiting for the deadline to admit it. The math is binary. Either the gold is there and the Treasury is deliberately undervaluing it for a future accounting trick, or the gold is gone and the $38 trillion debt has no collateral left. And here's the mechanism that ties it all together. Dominique Strauss-Kahn was the head of the International Monetary Fund in 2011. In May of that year, he was arrested in New York on charges that collapsed within weeks. His career was destroyed. The timing? 1 month before the Epstein email referencing the IMF chief and the missing U.S. gold, Strauss-Kahn was preparing to audit the Federal Reserve's gold claims as part of a broader IMF review of reserve currencies. The arrest happened before the audit could begin. The charges were dropped, but the audit never resumed. If this specific chain of custody just clicked for you, or you want to track these forensic level mechanisms as they develop in 2026, join the circle by hitting subscribe. Let's move to the deep dive. But even the Germany scandal is a surface level distraction from the real trap. Because the Treasury doesn't need to admit the gold is missing. They have a law that lets them revalue it by executive order and turn fake bars into $2 trillion of liquidity overnight. The law is called Title 31, United States Code, Section 5117. It's not classified, it's not hidden, it's sitting in the public legal code right now, and it gives the Secretary of the Treasury the unilateral authority to revalue the price of gold on the government's balance sheet by executive order. No congressional vote, no public referendum, no audit required. Here's the context. Right now, the United States Treasury holds 8,173.4 tons of gold. That's 261.5 million ounces. On paper, that gold is valued at $11 billion. You see, the Treasury doesn't use the market price of gold for accounting. They use something called the statutory price. And that statutory price, locked into law by Section 5117, is $42 $1.22 per ounce. The market price today is over $5,000 per ounce, which means the Treasury is carrying $800 billion in real-world value as $11 billion on the books. This isn't an error. This is the design. Here's how the mechanism works in practice. In 2026, the United States will pay over $1.6 trillion in interest on the national debt. That's more than the entire defense budget. The debt itself is $38 trillion in compounding. Tax revenue can't cover it. Austerity won't fix it. Printing more currency accelerates the debasement spiral. But the Treasury has a nuclear option. Under Title 31, Section 5117, the Secretary of the Treasury can issue an executive revaluation order. They can change the statutory price of gold from $42.22 per ounce to $10,000 per ounce. Instantly, the balance sheet changes. 261.5 million ounces times $10,000 per ounce equals $2.6 trillion. The Treasury was carrying it at $11 billion. Now it's $2.6 trillion. That's $2.59 trillion in ghost liquidity. No new taxes, no new bonds, no congressional approval, just a keystroke and a legal citation. Which means the Treasury can add nearly $3 trillion to the asset side of the ledger without touching a single gold bar. And here's the framing that matters to you. When the Treasury revalues gold by executive order, your purchasing power gets revalued too. Because while the government's balance sheet just gained $3 trillion, your paycheck is still denominated in the same debased currency. The price of oil recalibrates. The price of food recalibrates. The price of rent recalibrates. You didn't get the memo, but you're paying the bill. Now here's the deeper layer. If the Treasury is going to revalue gold from $42 to $10,000 per ounce, they need the bars to actually exist. Because the moment they execute that revaluation order, every sovereign creditor holding U.S. Treasuries is going to ask the same question Germany asked in 2013. Show us the gold. And if the vaults are filled with tungsten bars wrapped in gold foil, the revaluation becomes the trigger for a global creditor revolt. Which means the Treasury has two paths. Path 1, admit the gold is missing before the revaluation. This crashes the dollar overnight because the collateral backing the reserve currency is gone. Path 2. Execute the revaluation and hope no one demands a physical audit before 2027. You see, the 2026 timeline isn't random. In June of 2025, Congressman Thomas Massie introduced House Resolution 3795. It's called the Gold Reserve Transparency Act. The bill mandates a full physical audit of Fort Knox, West Point, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York within 180 days of passage. The bill is currently stalled in committee. It has 16 co-sponsors. It hasn't been brought to a floor vote, because if the audit happens before the revaluation, the game is over. The Treasury loses the ability to fabricate $3 trillion in liquidity. The debt spiral becomes visible, and the creditors who've been holding Treasuries since the Bretton Woods era realize they've been lending against ghost collateral for 70 years. Plus, there's a historical precedent for exactly this sequence. Dominique Strauss-Kahn was the managing director of the International Monetary Fund from September of 2007 to May of 2011. In May of 2011, Strauss-Kahn was arrested at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The charges were criminal sexual assault. The case was front-page global news for 6 weeks. By August of 2011, the charges collapsed. The prosecution admitted the accuser had lied under oath multiple times. The case was dismissed. But Strauss-Kahn's career was finished. He resigned from the IMF. He never returned to public office. Here's the timing that matters. In April of 2011, 1 month before the arrest, Strauss-Kahn was preparing an IMF audit of the United States gold reserves as part of a broader review of global reserve currencies. The audit was set to include physical verification of bullion at Fort Knox and the New York Fed. The arrest happened in May. The audit never resumed. And in June of 2011, 1 month after the arrest, an email appeared in what would later become Jeffrey Epstein's Dataset 9. The subject line referenced a Russian intelligence report claiming the IMF chief had been jailed for discovering all U.S. gold is gone. You see, Strauss-Kahn wasn't just any IMF head. He was a French economist with direct access to European central bank records. He knew Germany's gold was stored in New York. He knew the serial numbers. He knew the original vault manifests, which means if he walked into Fort Knox with an independent assayer and a drill, he could pull core samples and test the bars for tungsten. The arrest didn't need to result in a conviction. It just needed to delay the audit long enough for the revaluation window to open. Here's the mechanism condensed. The Treasury is carrying 8,000 tons of gold at $42 per ounce. The real value is over $5,000 per ounce. In 2026, when interest payments exceed the defense budget, the Treasury will use Title 31, Section 5117, to revalue that gold to $10,000 per ounce. That adds $3 trillion to the balance sheet. But if the gold is tungsten, the revaluation becomes the catalyst for a creditor run. And if the audit happens before the revaluation, the Treasury loses the ability to print liquidity out of fake bars, which means the system has one move left. Execute the revaluation in early 2026. Stall the audit until 2027. And hope the sovereign creditors don't demand physical verification before the reset is complete. Your purchasing power is the variable in that equation, because when the Treasury adds $3 trillion to the ledger without mining a single ounce of new gold, the dollar in your bank account just became worth less. Not in theory, in math. But the Treasury isn't operating in a vacuum, because while the US is preparing the 2026 revaluation, China has been stacking physical gold every single month since January of 2024. And they just restricted silver exports for the first time in history. This isn't the first time a reserve currency has used accounting fraud to delay a collapse. Rome did it. Spain did it. Britain did it. The script doesn't change, only the names and the dates. Here's the pattern. Rome controlled the Mediterranean through the legions. The denarius was the reserve currency because Roman soldiers enforced trade routes from Britannia to Egypt. Spain controlled the Atlantic through the Spanish Armada. The silver real was the reserve currency because Spanish galleons enforced trade routes from Manila to Seville. Britain controlled the oceans through the Royal Navy. The pound sterling was the reserve currency because British warships enforced trade routes from India to the Americas. The United States controlled the global monetary system through the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. The dollar became the reserve currency because the U.S. Navy enforced the petrodollar system from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea. The cycle starts with military dominance. The currency follows the fleet. Rome expanded into Dacia and Mesopotamia. The cost of maintaining legions at the frontier exceeded tax revenue. The Senate began borrowing against future conquests. Spain expanded into the Netherlands and the New World. The cost of the 80 Years' War and the Armada exceeded silver imports from Potosi. The Crown began borrowing against future bullion shipments. Britain expanded into Afghanistan and South Africa. The cost of the Boer War and the Great Game exceeded gold reserves. The Treasury began borrowing against future colonial revenue. The United States expanded into Iraq and Afghanistan. The cost of the Forever Wars and the global war on terror exceeded tax revenue. The Treasury began borrowing against future GDP growth. The cycle accelerates when the empire borrows to sustain wars it can no longer afford. Rome couldn't pay the legions in pure silver, so Emperor Nero reduced the silver content of the denarius from 95% to 90% in the year 64. By the time Diocletian took power in 284, the denarius was less than 5% silver. The rest was bronze and tin. Spain couldn't service the debt to Genoese bankers, so Philip II debased the silver real 4 times between 1557 and 1596. Each time, the Crown declared bankruptcy and reissued the currency at a lower precious metal content. Britain couldn't maintain the gold standard after World War I, so the Treasury suspended convertibility in 1931. The pound lost 25% of its value against gold overnight. The United States couldn't maintain gold convertibility after the Vietnam War, so President Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. The dollar lost 98% of its purchasing power against gold over the next 50 years. The cycle enters the debasement phase when the cost of maintaining the empire exceeds the value of the currency backing it. Rome didn't announce the debasement. They just melted down the old denarii and recast them with less silver. The coins looked the same. The soldiers didn't notice until they tried to spend them in the provinces. Spain didn't announce the bankruptcy. They just issued new relays with the same face value but lower silver weight. The merchants didn't notice until they assayed the coins at the trading posts. Britain didn't announce the devaluation. They just repriced gold from £4 per ounce to £6 per ounce. The bondholders didn't notice until they tried to convert their gilts into bullion. The United States didn't announce the tungsten swap. They just stopped the audits in 1953 and locked the vaults. The creditors didn't notice until Germany asked for their 300 tons back in 2013. You see, the Treasury doesn't need to admit the gold is missing. They just need to delay the audit until after the revaluation. That's the accounting trick. The bars stay in the vault. The serial numbers stay on the manifest. And the statutory price stays at $42.22 until the moment the Secretary of the Treasury signs the executive order to revalue it at $10,000 per ounce. Which brings us to stage 5. Rome lost credibility when the provinces refused to accept debased denarii as payment. By 330, the empire had fractured into the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. The center couldn't hold. Spain lost credibility when the Dutch and the English refused to accept debased reals in settlement of trade. By 1648, the Spanish Empire had lost the Netherlands and the trade routes to Asia. The silver stopped flowing. Britain lost credibility when the dominions and the colonies refused to hold pound-denominated debt after 1931. By 1947, India and Pakistan were independent. By 1967, the sterling area had collapsed. The United States is losing credibility right now. China has been buying physical gold every single month since January of 2024. As of December 2025, the People's Bank of China holds 2,306 tons of gold. That's up from 1,948 tons in January of 2024. Plus, China just restricted silver exports in September of 2025. This is the first time in modern history that China has used export controls on precious metals, which means China is preparing for a currency reset where physical metal becomes the settlement layer. And they're not alone. In October of 2025, China launched CIPS 2.0. That's the cross-border interbank payment system. It's the alternative to SWIFT. It settles in yuan, but it is backed by a gold referencing mechanism that allows creditors to demand physical delivery if the yuan devalues beyond a contractual threshold. You see, China watched what happened to Russia in 2022 when the US froze $300 billion in Russian reserves and cut Russian banks from SWIFT. They learned the lesson. If your reserves are digital and your payment rails are controlled by the hegemon, you don't own your collateral. So China built their own payment system. And they're backing it with physical gold instead of treasury bonds. Here's why the timeline converges in 2026. January of 2026 marks the peak of the commercial real estate maturity wall. That's $1.5 trillion in office and retail loans coming due. Most of those properties are worth 30 to 50% less than they were in 2019 because of remote work and e-commerce, which means the banks holding those loans are sitting on unrealized losses that exceed their Tier 1 capital. Plus, 2026 is the year the Treasury's interest payments on the national debt exceed $1.6 trillion. That's more than the defense budget, more than Medicare, more than Social Security. The math stops working in 2026, and the Treasury's only move is the Title 31, Section 5, 1117 revaluation. But if the Gold Reserve Transparency Act passes before the revaluation happens, the audit exposes the tungsten. The creditors panic, and the dollar loses reserve status before the reset can be executed. The script is written, the deadline is set, and the vaults are still sealed. The only question left is whether you position yourself before the revaluation or after the creditor revolt. Most people will ignore the 73-year audit gap and pay the price when the revaluation hits. They'll watch the headlines talk about economic recovery and monetary policy, while the Treasury quietly executes Title 31, Section 5117 in the background. They'll wake up one morning in 2026 and wonder why their rent just doubled and their savings bought half of what it did the week before. But if you're the type of person who refuses to be a victim of the script, subscribe to this channel. We hold ourselves to a different standard here. We track the laws, the deadlines, and the historical patterns the financial media won't touch, because the crime scene is still open, and the fingerprints are everywhere. Here's the summary. The United States Treasury holds 8,000 tons of gold valued at $11 billion on the books. The real market value is over $800 billion. In 2026, when interest payments exceed the defense budget, the Treasury will use Section 5117 to revalue that gold to $10,000 per ounce. That adds $3 trillion in ghost liquidity to the balance sheet. But if the gold is tungsten, the revaluation becomes the trigger for a global creditor revolt. And if the audit happens before the revaluation, the system loses its only exit. China knows this. That's why they've been stacking physical gold every month since 2024. That's why they restricted silver exports. That's why they launched SIPs as an alternative to SWIFT. The 2026 revaluation isn't a prediction. It's a mathematical certainty for a system with $38 trillion in debt and no other way out. The law is written, the vaults are sealed, and by the time they open the doors in 2026, your purchasing power will already be gone.